The woman's voice cut through the hum of the airplane cabin like a knife. "I don't feel comfortable sitting next to him," she said, her tone sharp and unapologetic. Heads turned. Passengers shifted in their seats, pretending not to. Listen but unable to ignore the tension crackling in the air. The flight attendant approached cautiously, glancing between the woman, Karen, and Marcus, who sat silently, his jaw tightening with every word. "Is there an issue here?" the flight attendant asked, though her hesitant tone suggested she already knew the answer. Karen leaned forward in her seat, her designer blouse catching the dim overhead light. "Yes, actually. I'd like to be moved. It's just uncomfortable." She didn't finish the sentence, letting it hang heavily in the space between them. Marcus heard every syllable, each one landing like a blow. His fingers gripped the armrest beneath him, knuckles whitening. He wanted to say something, to defend himself, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he stared straight ahead, trying to steady his breathing as anger bubbled inside him. Around him, passengers exchanged quick, nervous glances. Some whispered behind cupped hands. Others looked away entirely, unwilling to meet anyone's gaze. A man 2 rows back muttered under his breath, "This is why I hate flying." A young woman across the aisle shot him a disapproving look, but no one spoke up. The silence was deafening, broken only by Karen's relentless demands. "I'm sure we can find you another seat," the flight attendant said finally, her voice trembling slightly. She turned toward Marcus, forcing a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Would you mind moving voluntarily, just to make things easier for everyone?" Marcus blinked, stunned. "Easier for who?" he asked quietly, his voice low but laced with frustration. "You're asking me to move because she doesn't want to sit next to me. That's what this is about?" The flight attendant hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "It's not personal," she began, but Marcus cut her off. "It feels pretty personal to me." His mind raced, memories flooding back in vivid flashes. Just days ago he had stood on a stage in front of thousands, delivering a TED Talk that went viral overnight. People praised him for his eloquence, his passion, his ability to articulate the pain of systemic racism in ways that resonated deeply. And now, here he was, reduced to a stereotype, dismissed without a second thought. He thought of his mother lying frail in a hospital bed hundreds of miles away. She had worked tirelessly to give him a better life, juggling 2 jobs while raising him alone. This trip wasn't supposed to be about fighting battles, it was about saying goodbye. But now, this encounter threatened to strip away his dignity at the worst possible moment. As the flight attendant fumbled with the seating chart, a soft cough drew Marcus's attention. He glanced toward first class and locked eyes with a man, watching intently. The man's expression was unreadable, but there was something familiar about him, a presence that commanded respect. For a brief moment, Marcus wondered if he recognized him from somewhere. But before he could dwell on it, the flight attendant interrupted his thoughts. "We'll have you moved shortly," she said, avoiding eye contact as she gestured for Marcus to follow her. Reluctantly, he unbuckled his seatbelt and stood, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes on him. Each step down the narrow aisle felt heavier than the last, until he reached the empty seat near the back of the plane. As he settled in, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, that something bigger was coming. In first class, the mysterious man leaned back in his chair, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. Whatever happened next, he knew would change everything, for Marcus, for Karen, and perhaps even for the airline itself. Karen's voice carried through the cabin like a storm, sharp and unrelenting. "Honestly, it's not safe having people like him so close," she told the passengers seated nearby, her tone dripping with disdain. She gestured vaguely toward Marcus, who sat silently at the back of the plane, his hands clenched tightly. In his lap, the murmurs began almost immediately, a low hum of whispers rippling through the rows. Some passengers leaned closer to their neighbors, speaking in hushed tones. A middle-aged woman shook her head disapprovingly. "This is ridiculous," she whispered to the man beside her, though she didn't raise her voice loud enough for Karen to hear. Others avoided eye contact altogether, burying themselves in books or scrolling aimlessly on their phones, unwilling to get involved. Marcus felt the weight of their judgment pressing down on him. He could feel the divide forming, those who sympathized with him versus those who either agreed with Karen or chose neutrality. It wasn't just about this flight anymore. It was about every time he'd been made to feel invisible, every microaggression that had chipped away at his sense of belonging. He swallowed hard, trying to steady himself, but the anger simmered just beneath the surface. The flight attendant approached, again, this time with a security officer trailing behind her. The man was broad-shouldered and imposing, his presence alone enough to make Marcus tense up. "Sir," the officer said gruffly, nodding toward Marcus, "we've had some concerns raised about your seat. Is there anything going on here?" Marcus stared at him incredulous. "Concerns about me?" His voice rose slightly, drawing more attention from the surrounding passengers. "I'm just sitting here. I haven't done anything wrong." "It's not about what you've done," the flight attendant interjected quickly, wringing her hands nervously. "It's about making sure everyone feels comfortable during the flight." "Comfortable," Marcus repeated, his voice trembling now, not from fear, but from frustration. "So my comfort doesn't matter, just hers?" Karen smirked triumphantly, crossing her arms over her chest. "Exactly," she said smugly. "I shouldn't have to explain myself. You're the professional. Fix this." The audacity of her words sparked audible reactions throughout the cabin. Someone gasped loudly. Another muttered, "Unbelievable." Even the flight attendant flinched, though she quickly masked it with a forced smile. The tension was palpable, now hanging thick in the air like smoke. Just as the situation seemed to reach its breaking point, a calm but authoritative voice cut through the chaos. "Excuse me," came the smooth baritone, drawing all eyes toward the front of the plane. The mysterious man from first class stood in the aisle, his posture commanding attention. He wore an immaculate suit, his tie perfectly knotted, and his expression was one of quiet determination. "I couldn't help but overhear what's happening here," he continued, stepping forward until he was level with Karen and the flight attendant. "And I think it's important we address it properly." The flight attendant blinked rapidly, clearly unsure how to respond. "Sir, if you'll return to your seat—" "No!" he interrupted firmly, raising a hand to silence. "Her." Turning to the rest of the cabin, he spoke directly to the passengers. "My name is Victor Langston, and I'm the CEO of Global Wings Airlines. What's happening right now is unacceptable, and I want everyone to understand why." A collective murmur swept through the cabin as people processed his identity. Karen's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of unease. Before she could say anything, Victor turned to Marcus. "Mr. Johnson, am I correct? You're working with our company as a diversity consultant, aren't you?" Marcus nodded slowly, still processing the sudden turn of events. "Yes, that's right," Victor gestured, broadly addressing the entire plane. "Ironically, the very person Ms. Thompson finds so objectionable is someone we've brought on board, specifically to help combat the kind of prejudice she's displaying. That irony isn't lost on any of us, I hope," Karen sputtered, her face flushing red. "That's not— how was I supposed to know? Maybe your company should do a better job screening these consultants." Her voice cracked on the last word, betraying her desperation. Victor raised an eyebrow, his gaze unwavering. "Screening them or catering to baseless biases like yours." The words landed like a punch, silencing Karen instantly. Around them, passengers exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement, while others looked uncomfortable but intrigued. As the confrontation unfolded, a journalist seated near the rear of the plane pulled out her phone and began live streaming. The scene, within moments, hashtags like Just Justice for Marcus and Airline Racism began trending online, amplifying the moment far beyond the confines of the aircraft. Comments poured in, some supportive, others harsh, but the sheer volume of engagement underscored the significance of what was happening. Meanwhile, Marcus wrestled with conflicting emotions. Part of him wanted to stand up, to use this platform, to call out the injustice he'd endured. But another part hesitated, thinking of his mother lying frail in her hospital bed. Did he really want to risk becoming a target for online harassment, especially now? The internal battle raged within him, each thought pulling him in opposite directions. Sensing his turmoil, Victor stepped aside, motioning for Marcus to join him near the galley. "Listen," he said quietly, his tone softening. "I can't tell you what to do here, but I can offer you a choice. You can let this incident slide, walk away quietly, and focus on being with your mother. Or you can speak out, confront this head-on, and potentially spark real change. Both paths carry risks, but only you can decide which feels right." Marcus exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. For the first time, he allowed himself to consider the weight of his decision, not just for himself, but for everyone watching. Could he turn this moment of humiliation into something meaningful? And if he did, would it be worth the cost? As the plane buzzed with anticipation, Marcus took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever came next. Whatever choice he made, one thing was certain: the world was watching. Karen let out a smug laugh, her voice cutting through the tense silence of the cabin like a blade. "Oh, please," she sneered, leaning back in her seat with an air of superiority. "He's probably loving all this attention. People like him always do." Her words hit Marcus like a punch to the chest. He felt his breath catch, anger bubbling up inside him until it was almost unbearable. Every ounce of self-control he had been clinging to shattered in that moment. His hands clenched into fists at his sides as he rose slowly from his seat, drawing the eyes of everyone around him. "You want to know what I'm loving right now?" Marcus said, his voice low but steady, carrying just enough weight to command. "Attention. I'm loving how clearly you've shown everyone here exactly who you are." Passengers turned in their seats, some craning their necks to get a better look. The atmosphere shifted. The murmurs died down, replaced by an electric anticipation. Marcus took a step forward, his heart pounding, but his resolve unshaken. "I didn't plan to say anything today," he began, his voice trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the raw emotion coursing through him. "But since you've decided to make me the center of attention, maybe it's time we talked about why moments like this happen." He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "I grew up poor, in a neighborhood where people assumed I'd never amount to anything because of the color of my skin. My mom worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table while raising me alone. She taught me to believe in myself, even when no one else did. But no matter how hard I worked, no matter how much I proved them wrong, there were always people like you. People who looked at me and saw only a stereotype." His voice cracked as memories flooded back. The taunts in school hallways, the job interviews where he wasn't taken seriously, the countless times he'd been followed around stores simply for existing. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to, keep going. "And now here I am," he continued, his tone growing more urgent, "rushing home to see my mother one last time because she's dying. And instead of kindness or humanity, I get this. A demand to move seats because apparently sitting next to me makes someone uncomfortable." Tears welled up in his eyes, spilling over as he spoke. "You don't know me, Karen. You don't know what I've been through or what I'm going through right now. All you see is the color of my skin, and somehow that's enough for you to decide I don't deserve respect." The cabin fell silent, so quiet you could hear the faint hum of the engines outside. Passengers exchanged glances, some nodding slowly, others looking away as if they couldn't bear to meet his gaze. Even the flight attendants froze mid-task, unwilling to interrupt the moment. "We talk about equality, about treating everyone fairly," Marcus went on, his voice rising slightly. "But actions speak louder than words. Respect isn't something we earn, it's something we're owed simply because we're human. No exceptions." As he finished, the silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. Then, slowly, a single pair of hands began clapping. Another joined in, then another, until the entire cabin erupted in applause. Passengers stood, cheering loudly, their faces filled with admiration and shame in equal measure. Some wiped tears from their own eyes, moved by Marcus's courage. Karen sat frozen in her seat, her earlier confidence crumbling. She glanced around, frantically searching for support but found none. The same crowd that had once whispered nervously now stared at her with disdain. Panic flickered across her face as she realized she was utterly alone. Victor Langston stepped forward again, seizing the momentum. "Let me be clear," he announced, his voice ringing out above the applause. "Ms. Thompson will be banned from flying with Global Wings indefinitely. Furthermore, effective immediately, all employees will undergo mandatory anti-racism training developed in partnership with Mr. Johnson." Karen shot to her feet, her face red with fury. "This is ridiculous," she shrieked, pointing accusingly at Victor. "You can't do this to me. You're ruining my life." No one responded. Instead, two security officers approached her calmly, but firmly. "Ma'am, please come with us," one of them said, gesturing toward the exit. "No, you can't kick me off the plane," Karen screamed, thrashing as they gently guided her toward the door. Her cries grew louder, more desperate, until finally she collapsed into sobs, pleading for forgiveness. But the passengers remained unmoved, their expressions hardened against her. As the commotion faded, Marcus sank back into his seat, exhaustion washing over him. For the first time in hours or perhaps days, he allowed himself to breathe deeply. He looked around the cabin, meeting the eyes of those who had stood up for him, and felt something unfamiliar yet powerful: empowerment. He understood now, more than ever, that his voice mattered. That speaking out wasn't just about him, it was about every person who had ever been made to feel small or invisible. And though the road ahead wouldn't be easy, he knew he had sparked something meaningful, something that could change lives. For the rest of the flight, the mood in the cabin was different. Conversations buzzed quietly, not with gossip or judgment, but with reflection and hope. Marcus leaned back, closing his eyes, and let the weight of the moment settle over him. He had faced prejudice head-on and emerged stronger for it. The video of Marcus's speech spread like wildfire. Within hours, it was everywhere. Social media platforms, news outlets, even late-night talk shows. Millions watched as he recounted his journey, his voice trembling with pain but unwavering in its conviction. The hashtag #Justice for Marcus trends globally, sparking conversations about racism that reached far beyond the confines of that airplane cabin. Celebrities began sharing the clip, their captions filled with praise and calls to action. "This is what courage looks like," one famous actor wrote. A prominent activist tweeted, "Marcus reminds us that silence is complicity. Let's honor his bravery by speaking up." Even politicians weighed in, using his words to push for anti-discrimination legislation. His story became a rallying cry, a moment that galvanized people from all walks of life to confront the prejudices they'd ignored or accepted for too long. Schools started incorporating his speech into lessons on resilience and justice. Teachers played the video during class discussions, asking students how they would respond if faced with similar injustice. "What does respect mean?" one teacher asked her 8th grade class. "Does it depend on who you are?" Or is it something everyone deserves? Hands shot up eagerly, each student eager to share their thoughts. Marcus's words had planted seeds of change, inspiring young minds to think critically about fairness and equality. When Marcus finally arrived home, exhaustion clung to him like a second skin. He stepped through the door of his childhood house, the familiar creak of the floorboards beneath his feet grounding him momentarily. In the dimly lit living room, his mother lay resting on the couch, her frail body barely making an impression on the cushions. She couldn't speak anymore, but when she saw him, her lips curved into the faintest smile, a silent yet profound expression of pride. He knelt beside her, taking her hand in his. Her fingers were cold and fragile, but her grip was steady, anchoring him in a way no words ever could. For a while they simply sat together, the quiet between them heavy with unspoken emotions. He told her about the flight, about Karen, about Victor stepping in. Her eyes glistened with tears, though whether from sadness or joy, he couldn't tell. What mattered most was that she was there, still fighting alongside him in her own quiet way. In the weeks that followed, Marcus found himself reflecting deeply on everything that had happened. He realized he needed to document it, not just for himself, but for others who might need hope in their darkest moments. Sitting at his desk late one night, he opened a blank document and began typing. The title came easily: In Flight Toward Justice. Page after page, he poured out his heart, recounting not only the events of that day, but also the years of struggle leading up to it. Each word felt like a weight lifting off his shoulders, a step toward reclaiming his story. Months passed before Marcus received the envelope. It arrived without fanfare, tucked among bills and junk mail. At first glance, nothing about it stood out, just plain white paper, his name scrawled neatly across the front. But when he opened it, he froze. Inside was a letter, written in careful handwriting. Dear Marcus, I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know I'm sorry. What I did was wrong, and I've spent these past months trying to understand why I acted the way I did. You didn't deserve any of it. Enclosed is a donation to your charity. Please use it to help others like you, to fight against the kind of ignorance I showed that day. Thank you for teaching me a lesson I'll never forget. Sincerely, Karen. Beneath the letter was a check made out to Marcus's foundation supporting victims of racial discrimination. He stared at it for a long time, torn between skepticism and something resembling hope. Could someone like Karen really change, or was this just another performance, an attempt to save face? That night, Marcus sat alone in his study, the letter and check spread out before him. He thought about forgiveness, not as absolution for Karen, but as freedom for himself. Holding on to anger wouldn't undo what had happened. It would only weigh him down further. Slowly, deliberately, he picked up a pen and drafted a response. Karen, thank you for reaching out. Your apology means more than you may realize. It shows growth, and that's something worth acknowledging. I accept your gesture because it represents a chance for real change. Let's work together to build a world where moments like ours become history, not headlines. Sincerely, Marcus. As days turned into weeks, Marcus noticed something remarkable happening. Viewers began sharing their own stories online, inspired by his courage. One woman recounted standing up to a racist co-worker after watching his video. A teenage boy described defending a classmate targeted by bullies, saying, "If Marcus can do it on a plane full of strangers, I can do it in my school." These accounts flooded social media, creating a ripple effect that extended far beyond anything Marcus could have imagined. Finally, Marcus sat down to record a message. Looking directly into the camera, he spoke with the same passion that had ignited millions before. Racism thrives when good people stay silent, he said, his voice firm but gentle. It hides in whispers, in assumptions, in systems we take. for granted, but every voice matters. Every act of resistance counts. Together we can create a world where respect isn't earned, it's given freely because it's deserved. His final words lingered in the air, echoing the sentiment that had carried him through his darkest moments. No matter how hard the fight, truth and dignity always prevail. Have you ever faced discrimination while traveling? Share your story. In the comments, your voice matters. What would you do if you were in Marcus's situation? Would you stay silent or speak out? Keep watching to see how he turned injustice into empowerment. Up next, a gripping story about a black pilot who stood his ground against racism mid-flight. Subscribe so you don't miss it. Racism persists in ways big and small, but every share helps fight it. Like and spread this video to amplify its impact. Together, we can expose prejudice and demand change. Truth and dignity always prevail. No matter how hard the battle feels, standing up for justice inspires others to do the same. Let Marcus's courage remind you that your actions matter. Silence only fuels hate. Be the voice that challenges stereotypes and builds a fairer world.